you were watching the news last night, or you turned on your computer, you went to your social media pages, you found out that there was not a big red wave last night. There was no red tsunami. There were none of those gloom and doom predictions of the Republicans. We all know historically, whatever political party is in the White House, that party is expected to lose control of the House and the Senate. And typically that loss is a big one. Remember 2010, Obama's shellacking, he lost 60 plus seats in Congress. In some years, those numbers are as high as 30 and 40 seats. Well, so far, that has not happened. So we're going to be talking this morning about what does that mean? What does that mean for Republicans in 2024? What does it mean for Joe Biden in 2024? And what does it mean for our democracy? I have some of my favorite guests all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
There were so many predictions leading into the midterm elections about what would happen. Kevin McCarthy was already planning his new role as the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he even gave a speech last night where he predicted a win for a race that had already been called for a Democrat. Clearly, Republicans were not prepared for what happened last night. And what happened was voters all over this country went to the polls and they rejected many of the fringe, the extremists, and some of the kooky candidates put up by the Republican Party, candidates who had pledged their loyalty to Donald Trump. And because he is the grand master of the Republican Party, they made their way through Republican primaries. But when those same candidates got to the general election, many of them were summarily rejected by voters. Now, not to say that Republicans didn't have a good night, and as it stands today, they probably still will take control of the House. Doubtful that they'll take control of the Senate. But the bigger news coming out of the election results last night is that there was no big red wave. Joining me now is Richard Green. He's a Democratic political strategist. He's been on the show throughout the days leading up to the midterm elections, helping us understand how the Democrats could not just hold the line, but also pick up seats in the Congress and the U.S. Senate. So Richard is here to tell us what happened last night, or at least help us break down what happened. Good morning, Richard Green, and super excited to talk with you because I know you must have felt pretty good as you were watching those returns come in last night.
Yes, and I predicted this scenario, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much to Clarence Thomas, and thank you so much to Donald Trump, because if it wasn't for these two fine, upstanding Americans, we would have been looking at a red wave. Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett made last night happen. Because if you take away all the women who were really justifiably pissed off, who then realized, oh my God, I can't just stay home and type how pissed off I am. I'm actually going to go to the frickin' polls. And you took those votes away, Kevin McCarthy would already be the de facto speaker or Donald Trump. And the other thing is Donald Trump picking some really horrible candidates. So those two fine Americans allowed us to return some sanity to America last night.
And I know it's too early to tell, Richard, and your analysis, I think, is spot on. Women obviously probably punched above their weight. Women are already probably the most engaged demographic of voters, but younger women who may have sat out were motivated. Even Republican women, I saw interviews of young Republican women who went to the polls because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But some folks are saying that this is going to be the future of midterm elections. Midterm elections historically have not been high voter turnout elections. But because the country is so polarized and because people, have staked out a position, some predict that this is what we should expect going forward, that midterm elections will become like presidential elections. Do you buy into that?
I've been telling anyone who would listen for at least 20 years that the midterms are incredibly important. And finally, it looks like people are understanding. We have a national election every 2 years. One is named presidential, the other is named midterm. And in many ways, midterm elections are more important than presidential. We choose 36 governors. And by the way, I do think Kerry Lake is probably going to ultimately win in Arizona. We choose 36 governors in midterms and only 11 in presidential. So I am delighted that we're getting a little bit of a civics lesson. And I just want to say, it looks like because of Mandela Barnes' loss in Wisconsin and Catherine Cortez Masto's likely narrow loss in Nevada, and the loss of a few congressional districts here and there, we missed overturning the Supreme Court, codifying Roe v. Wade, and immediately restoring reproductive rights in January by around 100,000 votes.
Wow. If we lose that's Mastro seat that you're predicting we lose, what will that do to the balance in terms of the Senate? What will our numbers look like?
So what I was predicting was that we'd win Pennsylvania, we would lose Nevada, and there would be a runoff in Georgia. And in fact, that looks exactly like what's happening. And it's all going to come down to Raphael Warnock versus Herschel Walker as to whether Democrats hold the current numbers that they have in the Senate and this slim majority because of Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote. But it will not allow them because of Sinema and Manchin. Sinema and Manchin will still control everything in the Senate. It will not allow us to pass, reproductive choice, climate change, gun violence, all of that stuff. But at least we'd be holding the line.
Let's talk about some of these races. You mentioned Mandela Barnes. He just ran an incredible race, running against Ron Johnson, who is an incumbent Republican in a state that, maybe is considered purple, but definitely not a blue state. And he got very close. I mean, the numbers were very close. Ron Johnson pretty much used this scare tactics of crime. I mean, he spent, millions and millions of dollars trying to paint Barnes as being somehow soft on crime. And that message, must have resonated. I don't think anybody is surprised. We know how difficult it is to beat an incumbent. But do you think there's anything that the Democratic Party could have done to help get Mandela Barnes over the finish line?
So much. So much. I could take the rest of the hour talking about that, but the main thing is we need to punch back really strongly against two major Republican lies, in addition to the election lie. One is that we are soft on crime. We're not soft on crime. When there was looting and violence, even with the Black Lives Matter rallies, Joe Biden came out and was against crime. Everybody was, but we haven't hit it hard enough. And the other thing is that the vast majority of Democrats are not for open borders. Who wants open borders? People have passports. We're used to actually asking permission to go into a country according to their laws. So the Republicans have nothing other than whipping up fear around these issues. And I also think, and I'm hopefully going to be going to Georgia and helping to educate college students about this, that we needed to talk about numbers. Tim Ryan and Mandela Barnes should have explained a little bit of civics to the good people of Ohio and Wisconsin, saying, hey, we're 2 senators away from restoring your reproductive rights and all these other things. I will be one of those 2 senators. Right? We didn't make that case, and because we shy away from teaching civics, and that's a big mistake.
So I interviewed Reverend William Barber yesterday, leading civil rights, social justice voice in this country, leading advocate for poor people and what he calls low wealth people.
He's amazing.
He is incredible. He says one of the biggest mistakes that all elected officials or candidates make, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, is that they don't talk to poor people. They don't go into neighborhoods where poor people, he said they represent 43% of the US population. There are not elected officials who are talking to those people. They always talk about middle class and working class people. And they forget that there are some people who are not middle class or working class, they're poor. And so did we see anyone that did a good job of that? Because he said for the most part, both parties do a poor job at it.
You know how to get people to talk to poor people is to have poor people really show up and vote. Man, you're going to see people walking through every poor neighborhood in the country.
But he said they don't show up and vote because no one's trying to engage them. They're not investing in them.
Well, it's chicken and the egg, isn't it? It's chicken and the egg.
Well, what about Fetterman? But what about Fetterman? Let's celebrate Pennsylvania.
No, that's what I was going to say. Fetterman is the guy who can talk to anyone. He is the dictionary definition of authenticity, and that's what human beings love. That's why people love Bernie. That's why people think they love Donald Trump. So that's the model. Be real.
Yeah, that was a close race. But of all the Senate races, and I was pulling for Cherry Beasley, I was pulling for Mandela Barnes. But boy, I did not want Dr. Oz, who lives in New Jersey, who moved to Pennsylvania, definition of a carpetbagger, and was so cruel to John Fetterman after he had that stroke. I mean, he was a medical doctor who was just the epitome of a a-hole when it comes to a man who had a very, almost life-threatening physical, condition that so many Americans deal with or have family members who've had strokes. So I hope that people, when they went into the polls, they were saying, I don't even know if I love John, but I hate this guy because this guy is horrible.
Well, I used to be friendly with Dr. Oz. I don't know what happened to him, quite honestly. But the whole election, the real silver lining, the real gift, the dessert, is this image I have in my head of John Fetterman walking through the United States Senate day after day after day with a hoodie.
Okay, we had that debate, our pre-production meeting. Is there a dress code? Must you wear a jacket and a tie on the floor of the U.S. Senate? We were debating, could he keep the authentic hoodie and wrinkled khakis going?
So I actually don't know. I'll check that out. But the truth is, a majority of senators can change those rules at any time. It could be the John Fetterman exemption.
Yeah, let's talk about governors. We had a pretty good night, Democrats did, as it relates to governors. Let's give a big shout out to Wes Moore, 44 years old.
Amazing.
Incredible, dynamic, nonprofit leader, becomes the third Black person ever in the history of this country to be a governor. He flipped that governorship because Hogan had been the governor of Maryland and we had a Republican governor. Now we have a Democratic governor. Black Anthony Brown, Harvard Law graduate, give it up for Harvard Law, is the first Black attorney general in the state of Maryland. So Maryland had a pretty good night as Dems go. 2 Black men in the highest offices in the state, 2 Democratic Black men. So Wes Moore, there are already talks, Richard, about national, platforming him into a national figure. What do you think about that?
He's a rock star. Wes Moore is a rock star. There's nothing about him you can't like. He's amazing. The thing is, it balanced out. It was, to me, devastating, though, about 2 other governor races that Stacey Abrams, did so poorly in Georgia, and Beto. I mean, they've been fighting.
Well, let's talk about Beto. We're going to hold Stacey, so I want to bring on the next 2 guests because they're my women experts today. But you and I finish up about Beto, and then I'm going to bring them in. Okay, here's
Thanks for including this white man at the top of the show. I appreciate that.
No, we need you. Okay, Texas, Richard. How is it that these families, they just buried their kids in Uvalde? We've seen so many horrific shootings, and the governor in Texas gives out more guns, more access to guns. I shouldn't give out guns, but creating more access to guns, and they go to the polls and they reelect him resoundingly.
I'll tell you why. It's because of this rightward shift with Hispanics. I think that's going to be the difference. I don't know why we're losing Hispanics. It could be because of abortion and they're being conservative culturally and all of that. But man, Beto is just an extraordinary candidate. He was saying all the right things. I feel really badly. But if we lose Hispanics, we will never pick up or make any progress in either Florida or Texas. And that's a problem in the Electoral College as well.
Yeah, let's Florida, man. Some folks last night were saying we got to just give it up for a minute, stop investing money. DeSantis, has been appointed by God, right?
I heard that. Amazing. Who knew?
Anointed, I shouldn't say appointed, but anointed by God. And he has this speech says, this is where woke comes to die. So he's running his whole campaign. It's not DeSantis against, another candidate. It's DeSantis against woke liberals.
Yeah, and powered by God. I mean, doesn't get better than that. I am predicting a Ron DeSantis Kerry Lake ticket in 2024. Okay,
and that showdown, because Donald Trump now has to announce he's running for president as a way he thinks to buffer these indictments that are likely coming down against him, not going to shield him. But what do you make of this, predicted showdown between these two?
Yeah, he's not going to get the nomination. DeSantis is going to run circles around him. It's going to be a tough battle. It's going to be fun to watch. I hope they bloody each other up so badly they can barely make it into the general. But DeSantis is the future of the Republican Party. Look at that stunning win over a former governor, right? A pretty centrist former governor. He got destroyed.
Yeah, like a 20-point lead or so. And then he flipped Dade County. I'm telling all my friends, you better move out of Florida. But, here's the thing. New Yorkers that were upset about the COVID
mass mandates in New York vaccines. Yeah. I
mean, mass exodus of conservative Republican types that have moved into Florida. So when you think about who's moving into Florida, it kind of makes sense. Okay, we got to talk about women in the election. Let me bring in now Victoria Morin. She's a voter. She's a mental health professional. We all need a little mental health today. And Treva Lindsay, she's a professor of African-American history, women's history at Ohio State. She's the author of the book, American Goddamn, Violence, Black Women in a Struggle for Justice. Good morning, Treva. Good morning, Victoria.
Good morning.
How are you ladies feeling after last night? Abortion was on the ballot and abortion did pretty well. What are you feeling in this moment, Treva, looking at what happened? We were sad about Tim Ryan in Ohio, but, women showed up yesterday.
Women did show up yesterday. And I think folks who understand reproductive choice and bodily autonomy also showed up yesterday. And I think that's really important to note. I know we'll note both California, Vermont, having this enshrining that's happening, and Michigan. But also I want to point to Kentucky, that although access is limited severely there and restricted severely, that Kentuckians said no to a constitutional amendment that would put a permanent ban on abortion. That's incredible organizing work that led to this moment, and incredible organizing work that we saw across the country around reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I think so many pundits, because so many are white, male, older, miss the anger, miss the fury, and miss the organizing that was happening on the ground around reproductive rights. So I think that is one of the things that has me smiling this morning, and in this set of mixed feelings about what this tells us moving forward.
Yeah, you're in Ohio, Treva. I think you're dead on, spot on in terms of pundits and pollsters missing those younger women, what was happening on the ground with them. Oftentimes they're not answering their phones, answering polls. So they're not even included in those polls. And we know African-American are woefully underrepresented in most political polls. But what happened with Tim Ryan? He seemed like the perfect centrist Democrat for Ohio. And Ohio hasn't always been so red, but he got beat pretty badly.
He did. I mean, Ohio is quite red. I mean, we can look to our neighbors to the north and see the blue sweep that just happened. So there's possibility here. There's organizing possibility here, but we have to remember how Ohio is shaped. We're talking large pockets of blue, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, areas of the state, and largely really kind of rural red areas, suburban areas that are in this conversation. There's organizing work to do here. There's organizing work to do here with 18 to 29-year-olds that will be very telling in any upcoming election. We saw how they overperformed for Democrats across the country, that age range. Gen Z came in and showed out. And I think if Ohio wants a chance again at being more purple or even moving towards blue, then we're going to have to energize around 18 to 29. And we're going to have some real conversations around race, gender, class, and ethnicity that bring us back to the table in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and speaking of rural versus urban, Victoria, when we look at what happened in Georgia, same thing. We have Atlanta, which is obviously very blue. We have some other cities that are blue, but then you have all those rural areas. And now we have Stacey Abrams for the second time losing that election for governor, and this time by a much bigger margin than she lost when she ran 4 years ago. And I know you have been talking to some political pundits about what was happening in Georgia. What are you hearing about that race, or what were you hearing about it? What did you hear about? I'm trying to get my English right, sister.
Well, we're all waking up, right?
People got me on my toes here. So, girl, what did you hear about that race?
We were all watching CNN till late at night, right? So we're all tired. Hearing people talk about her image, which I feel is negative. Hearing people talk about that Brian Kemp has weighed the scales by making it even more difficult. We know that the wait times, having 20% plus more voting machines not working in certain key areas, it's heartbreaking. Knowing someone is like super qualified, she's a Spelman graduate, she's a Yale Law graduate, she has background in the legislature, and to see her lose by even a greater margin, that's a Freudian slip. I wish that she won. It's heartbreaking. And I think we look towards every Black woman in their strides, whether it's Kamala or whether it's Ketanji, and we see them break ceilings and we imagine what we can do for ourselves. So we wanted that ceiling to break as her being governor.
Yeah. So Richard, help us understand. You're going to Georgia, presumably to work in this runoff, which we expect will happen between Reverend Warnock and Herschel Walker. What do you make of the fact that Warnock held his own in terms of now going into a runoff, which is what we expect, but Stacey did worse in this election than she did 4 years ago? What do those numbers tell you?
It tells me that candidate quality does matter. The difference between Brian Kemp and Herschel Walker is huge. You may not like Brian Kemp, but he's like a normal human being. And I think that was the big difference there, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because the people who actually said, I'm going to vote for Herschel, I don't care how many women he slept with, how many abortions, because I want control of the United States Senate. That is honestly the way we all need to be thinking. You don't have to love your candidate. You just need to pick candidates who support what you want to have happen in this country. So, but I think Raphael's going to do well. We're blessed because of Donald Trump that we have had all these horrible candidates, because the truth is, if Raphael Warnock was running against somebody like Brian Kemp, he would not be going to a runoff.
But what do you make of the fact that Stacey didn't do as well as Raphael? So were there Democratic voters who voted for Raphael Warnock but didn't vote for Stacey? And were there Republican voters that voted for Brian Kemp but didn't vote for Herschel Walker? It looks like a little split ticket going on.
Mainly the latter. In fact, I remember seeing an interview of someone saying, I didn't vote in the Senate race because I couldn't vote for Warnock, but I really couldn't vote for Herschel Walker. We'll see what happens in the runoffs. I think there was a lot less enthusiasm for Warnock, especially amongst more moderate Republicans, and there are a lot of those in Georgia. So again,
what about that Libertarian candidate? Do you think he pulled on, whose numbers did he pull on? Because he got about 2% of the vote.
It's going to be close. Either way, it's hard to tell. And there's an argument to be made that he pulled from both. The point is, we need that 2% that he had. And here's the cool thing about a runoff. It's not limited to the people who voted, yesterday, right? We can get all sorts of new people. And that's why I'm going to go down there and talk to college students who didn't vote and say, hey, here's the difference in a Senate controlled by Mitch McConnell and a Senate controlled by Democrats. They don't understand that. When they do, I think they'll get out and vote.
Treva, what do you make of the comments that Victoria heard, and I heard similar comments. I was on a bus with a mayoral candidate, Karen Bass here, and there was a strategist from Atlanta who was up helping Karen Bass, and he said a couple of things. He said that a lot of Black voters had turned against Stacey because they thought she had gone Hollywood, and that she didn't have the same passion about being the governor. So he said a lot of Black women were not voting for her. And then that comment about her looks, that people thought, too ethnic, her weight, her hair texture, her hairstyle, those comments still coming up, and not from white voters. These were Black strategists, and then these Black women who were talking to the strategists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that matters. I think that is important in terms of our broad discussion about what happened. But as we look at these exit polls, let us be clear that Black people overwhelmingly supported Stacey Abrams. Black people overwhelmingly, even despite those concerns, and even with us performing, if we had gone 100% of those who voted in this electorate would not have changed this outcome, because white women and white men, by no percentage, came out in favor of Stacey Abrams. And I think that matters deeply in this conversation, that we be honest about the role that racism plays in this, that we be honest about the specific kind of racist misogyny that is up against candidates like Stacey Abrams, like Beasley, in North Carolina, and like other Black women candidates. We think that because a glass ceiling has been broken in one place, that the ceiling has collapsed, when in actuality, that burden becomes even more treacherous, even more difficult. And we point to the exceptions as opposed to what we've seen over a historical period of time with regards to Black women candidates. So Stacey had a lot against her going into this. And I think people did see her as too Hollywood. And I think that wasn't just Black folks in those conversations, that even from within Democratic spaces, we saw conversations about her being too Washington and not enough Georgia, that her main labor was getting the vote turned out, her fair elections work that she did. So Black women can do the grunt work, can be the political operatives, but are not often seen as the most viable candidates. And I think we saw that at the polls today. And I think that's something we have to reckon with in an honest and candid way.
Yeah, Richard, are those conversations happening, you think, in the Democratic Party? Because there was also, as I said, some critique of the party for not investing in Beasley's race. And some of the folks on my Twitter feed were saying, look, Beasley got as close as she did in that race because she did it on her own. She had very little support from, I guess it's the DSC, the Washington branch of our party that supports. Yes, that supports Senate candidates. Do you think that's a fair critique, that the Democratic, National Party did not pour enough into that race? And that perhaps it was because she was a Black woman?
Listen, if you're Chuck Schumer or you're Gary Peters, who was the head of the DSCC this cycle, all you care about, honestly, all you care about is winning, right? You don't care who's running. You just want the best primary person to emerge, who's going to do well in the general, and you have limited amounts of resources. And I think they looked at Tim Ryan in Ohio, they looked at Sherry, and they said, it's the return on our investment is very small. We're not going to win those races. Ohio is very much more red than we think, which is shocking. And North Carolina has always been tantalizingly close, but never really delivering. So honestly, I don't think it had to do with race in that case.
Let's talk about Val Demings. We talked some about Florida. Another disappointing race. Val was running ahead. She was raising lots of money. She killed it in the debate. What'd you make of that, Victoria? When you saw those numbers, and she didn't even get as close as Mandela Barnes or Cherry Beasley did in their races.
I think echoing what Treva is saying about Black women have been the backbone of this country, the Democratic Party, the way we turn up. I have a grandmother that was one of those little women that was at the voting poll, and they love us in that role. They love us door knocking and working and cleaning up the poll stations, but they don't like us out front. And it's heartbreaking. And when you look at the only way that I can make sense, and I'm not trying to be inflammatory, when you look at what's happening in Texas, you look at with the increased guns after Uvalde, is that we just have to recognize that the plantation is an organizing structure in the US before the Constitution.
Yeah, Richard, I agree with you, Richard, to the extent that Schumer and those guys just care about a win. But I don't think we can dismiss this. Obviously, we can't dismiss the issues of race and gender in some of these elections and how resources flow. What'd you make of Val's race, Treva? I mean, again, Val Demings seemed to, and again, you're running up against an incumbent. You're in Florida. I mean, you got a lot working against you. So it's not like it was going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it just seemed like the momentum of, she had the wins, the momentum behind her. And then, the numbers were pretty big in terms of her loss.
Yeah, I think this is a challenging one for a number of reasons. I think Val Demings, I'm someone who didn't see her winning coming into this. And I think I look at the tenor of Florida overall and thinking about this. So I didn't think her stellar performance in the debate or what we know about her. She's someone, because she is associated with law enforcement, who is kind of toting the kind of more mainstream moderate party line around the Democrats being tough on crime. Has a particular kind of experience with the criminal legal system. And so I think that there was not as much enthusiasm among progressives within the Democratic Party, and that's a truth. I think that there was considerable energy that's just there in Florida, that we see Florida being red. We can look at various things that have happened over the last couple of years in Florida to see that red transitioned and to see red voters. We also saw, and I don't want to discount in any of these races, the way gerrymandering and voter suppression also played out in these conversations in supermajorities. If we look at DeSantis specifically targeting formerly incarcerated voters and what that did with voters actually saying, I'm not showing up to the polls. So I think we go back to organizing. We go back to these spaces to look and say, how are we going to support Black women candidates who are the best candidates, right? From a merit standpoint, super qualified candidates who are coming up against racism and sexism in their own parties as well. And I think Val Demings is at this intersection of multiple failures and multiple realities that are complicated.
But we know that, as Richard said, looking at, we can't talk about Black women or Black candidates winning without talking about coalitions. Because in all of these states, for a Black woman to win statewide, we don't have a state where, I don't know, maybe there's a state where Blacks are the predominant population, but very few. They're probably in the South where we have no chance of winning. So you've got to build these coalitions, and those coalitions have to include progressive, Democratic voters, which oftentimes are going to be white voters. And then let's talk about Latinx voters. Richard said that they're skewing more conservative in some of these states. Treva, in the work that you're doing around Black women, what are you seeing with, Latinx women in particular? Is there an age, generational gap that's happening? Or older Latina women voting differently than younger ones? Is the Democratic Party going to lose, Latinx voters? This whole notion of them being people of color, which we know, that's such a big complex issue in and of itself. So what are you seeing in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is we have to be clear about what Latinx means, right? It is a large grouping for different racial, ethnic, national, and cultural backgrounds that we're encompassing here. There are Black Latino voters, there are white Latino voters, there are Indigenous Latino voters. This is a wide-ranging thing, and different communities, Cubans, Venezuelans, Mexicans, Salvadorians. This all looks very different. And state by state, we see differences in how they're showing up as well. And so I think a real tell for, again, the organizing wing, the Democratic Party, is to say, how do we speak to these in local context, and how do we speak to these kind of nationally exciting candidates that get greater support from these different communities under the large umbrella of Latinx voters? I think that will be really important. And to know that in some places we did see progressive wins that were supported by Latinx voters. And I think that's important to look at and see what those races got right, what factors played into that, and double down on those as we move forward with Latinx voters and the growing number of Asian American voters that we see in this race as well, who also are party that is a group that really is still, I would say, up in the air for either party to really grasp and build a kind of relationship that the Democratic Party has to Black voters, which is the only consistently and overwhelmingly reliable bloc for the Democratic Party in the United States.
Yeah, the Latin voters played an oversized role in what's happening in the LA elections of Victoria. And something interesting, I was watching Spectrum, local news station yesterday, and the head of some Latin organization at UCLA, a woman, she was on Spectrum, and she said that Rick Caruso, who's running against Karen Bass for mayor, invested in East LA, which is predominantly Latin populated, in an authentic way. And she said Karen Bass did not make a similar investment in the Latin community. I was just stunned. I almost fell off my chair listening to this woman say this. I wanted to write her a note, but what do you make of that? I mean, you've been watching what's happening in LA, the race, you've been following it closely. We know Rick has invested, significant dollars in Latin voters throughout the city of Los Angeles. But do you think that was a fair assessment that Karen Bass didn't invest in Latin voters?
It's absolutely unfair. She invested, she put sweat equity, she knocked on doors. She had fundraisers that we're talking like the Fernando Valley deciding, and particularly it just strikes a chord in my heart because we saw what Nuri did with the city council, and you had 3 prominent Latinx politicians and union head say derogatory things about Black politicians. So in light of this, then to have this false accusation, it double hurts.
Yeah, Richard, what are you seeing in LA? I think LA is a good test case for what Treva is talking about when we talk about Latin voters. First of all, there is no monolithic Latin vote. Lots of different communities. There are generational issues, there are immigration issues that separate them, there are, cultural issues. What are you seeing happening in LA? Because we also had 2 Latino sheriffs on the ballot for LA County sheriffs. And it looks like Robert Luna so far is likely to win and beat the incumbent. So what are you making of Latin voters in LA? Are they skewing more conservative? Or are they skewing more progressive? Where are they?
Yeah, I think we'll find out when we analyze the vote in the mayor's race. I just have, speaking of this race, after the Democratic Party in Hollywood last night, I went to go watch the results with a dear friend of mine, very, very progressive. And it came up about Karen versus Rick. And I said, oh, so who'd you vote for? You vote for Karen, right? And he goes, no, this is a super progressive white guy. And I said, why? He said, I'm sick of homelessness in this city and I'm sick of crime. And I think Caruso is going to be the one who is better to handle that. And if Rick wins, which I think he will, that's why.
Yeah, but that's so interesting because I don't know your progressive friend, but you just said he's a white guy. There is no way that white guy could conclude that Rick Caruso is better on homelessness than Karen. What would be the premise of that conclusion, other than the $100 million of slick advertising to tear Karen Bass down?
I think there is a perception that Rick Caruso, because he has built so much in LA, and it's been material, it's real, it's concrete, right? And we've all enjoyed the Grove and other places, that he's a guy who's going to say, I don't care what it takes. I'm a developer. We're going to deal with the issues and we're going to fix it. We're going to clean it up. We're going to make it happen. There is that perception, and that is very important for voters, especially when they are really upset about a particular issue. They want someone who can get shit done. And I think whether it's true or not, I mean, listen, I've been saying, excuse me, Karen Bass, has an incredible history of accomplishment. She was Speaker of the California State Assembly and, the head of the Black Caucus in Washington. And she sponsored the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And, she lost a child. And so she has that incredible deep sense of personal empathy, on and on and on. But when people are scared or when they're really pissed off, they make emotional decisions, not intellectual ones.
Yeah, let me just push back on those points you made. Rick is not going to win, so let's be clear about that. And let's be real honest, Richard. It's not just get shit done. It's a perception that white men can better manage budgets. They're better at business. It's the same argument that people bought into with Donald Trump. He was another billionaire developer who said, give me all of the problems of the country and I can fix all the problems. because I know too how to get shit done. That was exactly the argument that Donald Trump made. And now here we are on the verge of multiple federal and state indictments. And we know he didn't get anything done as it relates to that. But it is a perception. So we should call it out. I mean, you're right. People vote their emotions, but they're also voting their fears, and they're also voting their stereotypes. And we know the stereotypes is that Black women are not the business people. They're not the managers of money. They're not the developers. Rick Caruso has not built a single unit of affordable housing. Building affordable housing is as different. Building affordable housing and building luxury malls are as different as, Richard Green and Areva Martin. That's how different those two things are. And your progressive friend has bought into those
agree on almost
stereotypes.
everything. What are you saying? We are almost
No, we don't
the
agree on
same
most
person.
things. But that is the thing. And so, Treva, let's talk about that. How do we break down those stereotypes? Because that is what that progressive guy is saying. He's not saying the quiet part is not being said, but essentially that's what he's saying. And I've had this conversation with.
You're accurate. This is a really good guy, but I agree with you. The perception is really pervasive, and it's been around for a long time.
And let's talk about the crime. The crime perception is that, again, that a white guy is going to come in with this heavy-handed law and order, and he's going to crack some heads of these Black and brown criminals in a way that a Black woman wouldn't. Because, of course, when you talk about crime, it's just coded language for Black and brown people who are considered to be dangerous, mostly Black men. So, Treva, we've broken through, as you said, there's some exceptions, but that pervasive, that pathology is still so pervasive in our culture. And it's not just amongst white people. There are Black people who have bought into that white supremacist narrative. I spent 2 hours on Saturday with a Black woman friend of mine who says she wouldn't vote for Karen Bass. And when I, tried to drill down on it, it really was just this sense that as a Black woman, she wouldn't be as strong as a white guy. I almost threw her out of my car. I was going to have to be on the news, so murder myself. But how do we, I'm trying to be calm, Victoria, so I don't have to come to the office on your couch.
I understand. And it is frustrating because I'm sitting here like, if I had $100 million, you know what I wouldn't do? Run for mayor. I'd actually do something about ending houselessness in the country.
Nobody holds them to that standard. Nobody's ever said, dude, you could have been doing this, 30
other
years
ways
ago.
to do this work. But I think houselessness and how we talk about crime are so deeply intertwined, and we don't want to get to that. So with Richard speaking about fears and perceptions and all this, we've literally been here before. We literally had this in the 90s as it pertains to what we then end up with the crime bill, what we then end up with targeted mass incarceration, the prison industrial complexes. We're attempting to, in many ways, some people trying to end mass incarceration, some people trying to reform our criminal legal system, and some people talking about abolition, right? I mean, we have a spectrum in response to that. And to note, an abolitionist did win a state office in Colorado. A Black woman abolitionist won a state seat in Colorado. I think it's important in this moment to name that what we're seeing in this is that if we see what we did in the 90s, and that included Black people being supportive of tough on crime policies, we like to misremember that this wasn't something that was collectively invested in across race, across generation in many ways, with regards to being tough on crime. And we still haven't addressed the issues that result in higher rates of violence, the spike in violence that we've seen, which is tied to housing, which is tied to wages, which is tied to environment, which is tied to so many different issues. And I think when we look for the superficial basis and then say a Black woman won't manage this, a Black woman will be so-called soft on these things, the perception of these things versus the person who gets at the root cause of these things, which I think is something that Karen Bass is far more qualified to do than Rick Caruso, we end up in this cycle of reelecting and doing the same thing in elections. Rick Caruso is a very familiar candidate to me. And to hear how he has garnered so much support from self-identified progressives and liberals is extraordinarily frustrating, because I expect us and want us to be smarter than that. I want us to be smarter than our fears and our perceptions and our leaning into pathologizing narratives about Black, brown, and poor communities. It is well past time to do that work.
Yeah, and you know what, Treva, what's so frustrating is Karen Bass got painted as the same old, the familiar candidate. And what you just said is what, again, the quiet part out loud is the same old candidate is the rich white dude, is the white savior narrative, which has been played out over and over and over again. But, we can't say that because that's not politically correct to say. We can't talk about race because we're so uncomfortable with talking about race. Now, if this were June of 2020, after we watched George Floyd get murdered, we could have a really open, full conversation about race. But now we're in 2022 and like, oh my God, we're back, race is back in the closet in so many ways. And this race, this mayor's race, the issue of race, everybody has been so quiet about, even though, as you just so eloquently stated, Rick Caruso is the familiar candidate. All right, guys, I got to go. My producers tell me I got to move on. You guys are brilliant. Thank you for joining me this morning. We still have so many votes to be counted in key races. And there's a lot of fear about, are those, votes going to be counted in a fair and honest way? Are we going to see a ton of lawsuits being filed? We already know a Republican filed a lawsuit in Detroit to throw out all the ballots before they were even counted. So there's a lot of work still to be done with our election and our election process. So thank you, guys. We're going to watch these races. Richard, I'm going to take you out for a drink when Karen Bass wins and crosses the finish line. You'll be in Georgia, helping Raphael Warnock, which I'm so happy to hear, go down to Georgia, get those young people registered to vote so we can at least maintain the Senate and try to get something done over the next 2 years. The gridlock that's going to happen in Washington is just unimaginable if we don't maintain the Senate. Again, thanks for all of your voices this morning. All right, we're talking about voting and how do we count those votes in key elections. And William Roberts is back with us. He's a managing director of democracy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome back, William. Oh, we are all pins and needles watching some of these close races. Richard just predicted that Carrie Lake is going to be the next governor in Arizona. And we know she is a big Trump supporter. She supports the big lie about the election. We know there's some other tight races, and there is some real fear out there that there may not be, these votes may not be fairly counted. What are you hearing? And what do we need to do to make sure that every vote is counted and that the vote counting process is fair?
Well, first, thanks for having me back. Good to be with you. You're right. I think that there are some lingering questions, some of that being driven right by folks who have been election deniers, pushing the big lie. The first thing I would say is that folks should have confidence, voters, should have confidence that you went to the polls to do your job, and now it's the job of the election officials to do theirs, to count every vote, most important. And even though, we saw some run-of-the-mill issues, with the instances of, ballot paper running out, things of that nature, those are things folks should remember that happen every election, but that, election officials are on top of that. And so the main thing is that every vote needs to be counted right now so that everybody's voice can be heard and can do that accurately. So I think voters should have confidence in that. The other thing I would say, I'm not so sure about Carrie Lake. I want to strongly disagree, hopefully, but we saw folks like her and others, over 300 election deniers on the ballot up and down, federal and state offices, and many of them lost. And I think that's something that can't be a thing that can't be lost on voters paying attention to this, that, we talked about all these folks and the threat to democracy they posed, and many of them, including running for offices like Secretary of State and governors that have control over elections, lost their election. And that's good for democracy.
Yeah. What about lawsuits? Are you expecting, like I mentioned, that Detroit lawsuit that was filed even before, ballots had been counted? Do you expect to have or to see what we saw after Donald Trump lost the presidential election, we saw, I don't know, he filed 60 plus lawsuits. Do you expect to see a bunch of lawsuits challenging, let's say if Kari Lake does lose?
So, I think the reality is we are going to see some lawsuits, right? And again, we got to let those processes play out. I think that there are going to be folks, and she even, not to keep talking about her, but she teed this up a little bit when she came and spoke, even before the votes had been counted, sort of trying to sow this false claim and false hope that, well, if I lose, it must have been because there was cheating. So there will be some lawsuits, and there already have been some that have been sort of sorted out before Election Day. I think we're going to have to let that process play out. The thing that, we do need to be watchful for, certainly we saw Donald Trump and others on Truth Social and wherever they have these conversations, trying to stoke people to, to resist, to get in the streets, et cetera. We haven't seen what we were really concerned about, which was the potential for, violence at the polls with things like that was going on in Arizona with the, armed poll watchers. And so I think this post-election period is going to be really critical for folks, one, to make sure, that we allow the processes to play out and allow election officials to do their jobs, but two, for officials, federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, all of us to be vigilant about the potential for mis and disinformation to start swirling, right? Because this is really the period where the sort of extremists in the MAGA crowd, MAGA set, are going to start to really, keep their focus on places like Arizona, Nevada, where it's closer, right? Interestingly, we may not see that same kind of activity in Pennsylvania because Fetterman beat odds so handily and odds is already conceded, right? But so that is one of the things that folks need to be watchful for and make sure that they are, getting valid information from actual, official resources and not on Truth Social.
Well, there's a big fear, William, with Elon Musk buying Twitter, that he was doing it to be disruptive, to try to, support and encourage the red wave that didn't happen. We know he came out with a tweet a day before the election or so, encouraging people to vote Republican, saying that it was the Democratic Party that was divisive. We know he is the big purveyor of disinformation on his own site that he recently purchased, but it doesn't seem like, his disruption of Twitter had much impact on the election. Are you surprised by that?
Not surprised. I think I'm glad by that. I'm glad of that fact. I think you're right. We're super concerned and remain concerned that, Twitter is essentially the global public square, right? And to have someone who is so hostile to the norms that a lot of organizations and advocates have been talking to Twitter about putting in place, not just, from between now and the last election, but even in terms of cracking down on hate speech and harassment. And Musk seems to want to do away with all of that as he's trying to turn out his staff, right? And so really concerned and watching that, but I think pleasantly surprised that even though that stuff did crop up on Twitter, that, it did not sort of catch fire as it had in the past. Some of that, I think, is because organizations and groups on the ground have been in a much better position going into this election, understanding, what the threats of dis, and malinformation could be on Twitter and trying to inoculate against that, working with election officials and state officials at the state level, to be sort of trusted voices on the right kind of information. So I think we've got to stay on that, keep that same energy with Twitter and Musk on all those things, because I do think there's a real danger about the way that he's running the platform and the operation that could spill over, right?
What defenses do we have when you have a Twitter that has 235 million users? You have a Fox News that has the largest cable viewing audience in the country. When those big organizations spread disinformation, how do we fight back? People start parroting what they hear on those stations. And we were talking about the local mayor's race in Los Angeles. A lot of the ads that were, bought by this billionaire were lies. So in many ways, that was disinformation, but yet the news, the networks allowed the ads to run. They took the money and, he made a lot of folks rich in this election cycle, So what defenses do everyday people have against this information that's spread like that, even by quote unquote reputable sources?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of work being done by folks in the tech and democracy space, focusing on content moderation of platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Some of it, a lot of it, really associated with election disinformation. Again, that cropped up in 2020. Rules that were put in place that have become lax at Facebook and Twitter. I think there's a lot of organizations doing work around that to sort of pressure name and shame platforms to uphold the rules that they had put on themselves, right? There's also another conversation about what kind of rules and regulations Congress may or not be able to put in place, figuring out how to do that and respect the First Amendment is a whole ball of wax, as we know. But the other thing, the thing that like regular folks should understand, the regular Twitter user that's going to pop it up on their phone or whatever, is that it's really, really important, again, on the information side, that you get this information from trusted sources. And it may seem like a small example, but even the work that's been done to really get voters to understand that, for instance, no matter how long it takes, every ballot needs to be counted, that election ballot counting doesn't end on election day, things that the MAGA right seized on in 2020 to really whip people up and to get the average person to really question their elections and election structure in the way that they didn't before. That sort of inoculation that folks were doing in the run up to on platforms and directly with folks has seemed to work a little bit. Right now, we'll see. Hopefully it continues to work in places like Arizona, Nevada, where the count is close and it's going to take a little while. But in ways that I had fully expected it to crop up, it hasn't so much, and I think that is a victory, a current victory. We can't sort of rest on our victory, but it's a victory in terms of trying to get people on the right path with that information. And we got to stay really vigilant because it is dangerous, right? And especially with the digital platforms, it is an uphill battle when you have somebody who's got all the power on the public square, basically, who is not interested in making sure that they are fighting back on mis and disinformation.
Yeah, lots to obviously track as we, go through the next couple of days, next couple of weeks. Some of these races are so close that we won't know the outcome, and particularly LA County, Los Angeles, everybody gets mailed a ballot in the state of California, and you can literally drop that ballot in the mail up until the last day, which is November 8th, yesterday. So people who are predicting races in California need to slow their roll, because some of those ballots that were dropped in the mail on Tuesday haven't even made their way to the registrar's office. They haven't even been opened. And we know that people, like you said, Richard and Carrie Lake, people jump to conclusions on early vote counts, and sometimes those numbers don't hold true. So we've got to be patient. Voting today is not like voting 20 years ago, when on the end of election day, we knew who the winners and the losers were. In many of these close races, we just have to be patient to see what happens. But I'm encouraged that a lot of the horrible things that could have happened didn't happen. And maybe that's a good sign for 2024, that we will have a more sane presidential election, and that, some of the disinformation around the integrity of our election system has been dissipated. So thank you, William, for the work that you're doing. Thank you for joining me this morning and helping folks understand what's happening with our, election integrity around the country. I want to thank all of my guests. I want to give a big thanks to Richard Green, political strategist, who has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in these elections. Glad to see he's going into Georgia. He's going to be talking to those 18 to 29-year-olds or 18 to 25-year-olds who are on college campuses, because there's so much there in terms of college votes. We saw Vice President Kamala Harris, who came out to speak at a rally for Karen Bass on Monday at UCLA, and then there were long lines. I'm going to give her a lot of credit, the vice president, for helping to get that vote out on the UCLA campus. My son has autism. I took him to vote. Disability vote. People with disabilities, another huge demographic in this country that I don't think any candidates spend enough time talking to people who have disabilities. A lot of people with disabilities don't think that they can vote. They may have difficulty accessing the polls. Their family members don't know that they can provide assistance in filling out the ballot. So I think we need to do a much better job of targeting people with disabilities and their families. We heard Reverend Barber yesterday talk about the poor and low wealth vote. Neither party doing a good job talking to poor people, calling out the issues that poor people face and investing in those communities where poor people are. We heard Reverend Barber say there are millions and millions of voters in poor communities in these states where there are tight elections that could have made these elections a lot less tight and could have turned the tide on some of these Democratic elections. And, Richard said his friend said he's tired of the old. If you're really tired of the old, I think we should take to heart what Reverend Barber said and start targeting these voters who have not been engaged, because we do spend so much time talking about suburban white women. We spend so much time talking about suburban voters, and we hardly hear anything about those low wealth, those poor voters, disabled voters, and their votes there to be gotten. So we can spend less time worried about what white women are going to do because they're unpredictable. We relied on them in 2016 and we saw how that turned out. We'll see how they voted in these elections, but there's so many more votes that Democrats can be picking up. So I hope there's some lessons learned from what Reverend Barber is saying. Want to again thank Treva Lindsay. She is the author of a book, America Goddamn, Violence, Black Women and Struggle for Justice. It's one of her books. Make sure you pick it up. I love her voice. I love her insights on issues and being so unapologetic about calling out these issues of race. We can't fix our racial problems in this country if we are not willing to confront them, address them. And we can't dress up issues of race with, these old stereotypes and this coded language. And I think the mayor's race in Los Angeles, no matter what happens in this race, no matter who wins, although I am so confident that Karen Bass will win, but whoever wins this race, I think it's a good case example for the issue of power, wealth, and race that we need to pay very close attention to as we move into 2024, because we're already hearing grumblings about, women like Kamala Harris and other women of color, how they cannot win an election in this country. And we, again, have to ask ourselves, can they not win because they're not qualified? Or are people not going to vote for them for the same sexist and racist reasons that we've seen played out in so many races over the course of the history of this country? So my words to live by: be patient. Be patient. All of those races that are close, they are close, and fretting about them won't make them less close. Making too early predictions aren't, again, going to serve anyone well. So I'm going to take my own advice. I'm not going to read a lot of news about what's happening in the LA race. I'm going to focus on some of those national races. And in due time, we will know who the winners and the losers are of the 2022 midterm elections. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.